Hey, good morning, everybody. And good morning to everyone on the screen and here at the IBO. I'm going to call the meeting to order. We don't need to introduce ourselves. I'm Jennifer March. We know who everyone else is. So the first order of business is to adopt the minutes from the September 13th meeting. Are there any comments or changes requested to those minutes? If not, can I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Thanks, Mark. And everyone in favor?
Aye.
Great. It's been a productive quarter at the IBO, and this is our last meeting of the calendar year. So I'm going to turn it over to Louisa.
Thank you. Can you advance one slide? Oh, no, the second page, that's right. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to do is welcome our new team members and also recognize everyone who's been promoted. Malek. Press Secretary, Zach Herman, capital budget analyst. I saw him on screen. Sarah Internicula on screen. And Emma Gossett. Yay. And also promotions, Joy D. Roy, economist at large. Julia Conrad, the Assistant Director for Education. Brian Kane, Assistant Director for Housing, Environment and Infrastructure. Lina Garter, our Chief Outreach and Engagement Officer. And Jackie Sherman, taking on Chief Innovation Officer in addition to General Counsel. And forfeiting sleep. Thank you, Jackie. And I also just want to take the sad moment to note that Alan Trefesian, a long-term economist who spent over 25 years with IBO generating critical information to the city, retired and shortly thereafter passed away in September. And we appreciate everything Alan did for the city and recognize his sort of behind the scenes critical work, particularly in this round when other people would try to do it. So we, recognize his passing. Okay. Here's the org chart, which is a little bit full to get on one page, but I think the main thing here to note is that we still have some vacancies, and while most of the city is on a hiring freeze, we are cautiously continuing to staff to the level that the charter mandates we operate at. So for your perusing pleasure. Next slide. We're now on the recent publications page. These are the publications that have been issued since our last meeting. We're going to highlight some of them today. And I also want to say that this document is a screenshot of our new software that tracks how we publish, which is a really exciting development here and is adding to the overall clarity in issuance towards publication. So we laud everyone who has moved this forward. And now on to the November. Any questions on this particular page? We're going to highlight some of these later on in this presentation, but it just shows the variety and the frequency of how often we publish. Hearing no questions, we'll proceed to the next page. Oh, hi, Dean. Dean, Justin, please, here, just in time for the November plan response. Dean, we've covered new hires, promotions, the very exciting org chart, the screenshot of our software project showing all the publications to date, and we're about to start the November plan. So the city charter requires that the IBO both forecasts, in other words, project the economy and understand revenues, or make its analysis of revenues to the city, and present a response to the November plan. And so this year, following our charter mandate, we did that. We created a series of reports. The central mind the gap, i.e. the report on the balance between revenues and expenditures. We also have done secondary and critical reports, one on asylum seekers published on Monday, and the second on PEGs to be published imminently. So I'm going to ask the couple people who've led that work to speak on it, starting with Sarah Parker, who, no, previous page, who led the fiscal outlook report.
So good morning, everyone. As Louisa just said, on Monday, IBO testified, and this coincided with the release of our report on sort of the state and IBO's pulse on what New York City's fiscal health looks like. So per the charter, IBO is required to do an independent economic and revenue forecast, which we do 3 times a year. And out of that, one of the things that we were finding, one, our economic forecast didn't change that much from where we thought we would be in May. And both reassuring that the track we were on in May is correct, but also reaffirming the fact that the city and the national economy appears to be relatively stable, all things considered. And by that I mean inflation has cooled. The Federal Reserve has been raising interest rates, but there thus far are not indications that this is going to or has triggered a recession, which there was more uncertainty on which path the national economy was going to take back in April and May when we last did this exercise. So what this means, so our job estimates for the New York City's economy came out relatively similar to where OMB did. This is returning to our pre-pandemic level of employment in the city. This is 77,000 jobs in this year and adding a slower but still increasing number of jobs at around 61,000 annually in future years. So with this economic forecast, sort of as the landscape, we looked at revenues. And IBO's revenue estimates overall came in higher than OMB's, particularly in several areas. We didn't unilaterally come in higher. We think cannabis is going to be lower than their projections, in part because of the delays in getting dispensaries up. But that is a really small tax in terms of revenue to the city, although a much talked about one. But particularly with property taxes and personal income tax, IBO thinks revenues will come in stronger. This means we have more money coming in than OMB is saying. The counterpart to that, of course, is looking at expenses. And IBO, besides just doing not even just, it's a lot of work. Besides doing an economic and revenue forecast, we also look at expenditures across the city's budget. And analysts are assigned a portfolio of agencies to sort of do a deep dive onto those agency budgets. And we reprice expenditures for things that we think will either cost more or cost less. So in this case, and in this plan, we found things that fell into both buckets. In the near term, so in the current fiscal year, 2024, and in 2025, IBO anticipates that asylum seekers, the cost will come in lower, quite a bit lower than what the mayor's November plan was projecting. Claire will speak about that in a little bit in more detail. And then there's a lot of vacant positions in city agencies, and with a hiring freeze in place, it is going to be much harder to fill those. There are exceptions to the hiring freeze for health and safety positions, but even then, in discussions with agencies and in discussions with OMB, there's a lot of discretion and a lot of questions as to whether those positions that agencies would like to fill are able to be filled. So even factoring that in, we believe that there is quite a bit of savings to be expected on the personnel line, particularly across the city, in this fiscal year. However, there's things that also we expect will cost more money. And again, we looked at this sort of agency by agency. So I'm going to talk about these in terms of topic budgets. But overall, when you stitch it all together, it creates it creates a picture in the later years of more city funds for things that either are currently being paid for out of COVID stimulus money, or things that the city has either baselined or does not funded in the out years that we expect will need to be continued to be funded. So examples of this in education, we have, currently we're using COVID stimulus money to pay for early childhood education, and other programming in the DOE budget. There's reason to think that the city is going to continue that, and so that would require city funds in future years. An example of something that is expected to cost at least what historically it has cost and is underfunded in these future years are Carter cases. So the city paying for services and schooling for students with disabilities that the city schools are unable to meet. This is a growing cost to the Department of Education. It is something we track quite closely because it is a large budget concern within the education budget. And this is quite notably underfunded in future years. And without a drastic policy change on the part of the city, there is an expectation that these costs will continue, if not increase over time. So when we stitched all of this together, you get to the overall picture, where IBO is expecting a $3.6 billion surplus in the current fiscal year. Again, largely driven by both an increase in expected tax revenue and then a decrease in asylum seeker costs and city personnel costs. Those are the large drivers of where IBO landed on this anticipated surplus. Assuming that is used to prepay expenses for next year, this puts the 2025 gap at a much smaller amount than the 7.1 billion that the mayor put forth in the November plan, puts it at $1.8 billion, which, while a deficit is something that in a budget of this size, we expect the city to be able to absorb without too much pulling of hair. The future years, 2026 and 27, we have larger gaps than OMB. Not by a whole lot, but still these large gaps are looming. Two things to note there: IBO did not reprice asylum seekers in those future years, nor did we do any adjustments to personnel costs. So that is one of the places that impacts the earlier years that we don't see in the future years. Honestly, we don't feel comfortable trying to say that we know what asylum seekers and associated expenses will look like in 3 years, in 4 years. And so for that, we chose to focus on the near term.
I think it is worth saying that traditionally IBO has looked at agency expenditures agency by agency, and this year we're doing this different for this round, we're doing a different report on PEGs, looking across the board, so not just by agency, but at the totality of the PEGs that will take effect January 1st and some of the impacts. And we're going to repeat that type of analysis later early in 2024, looking at the totality of programs that are where funding is not present in the budget, either because COVID monies are ending or because they are programs that, while expected to continue, are not generally funded at the scale that history would indicate they should be. Anyone who can come up with a cute acronym beyond fiscal cliff is awarded a prize. Issues like, and we understand why. We've had discussions with our advisory board members that, for example, uniform services overtime, there are motivations to keep the numbers present in the budget by those administering the budget. But from the transparency and budgeting perspective of the IBO, we see a history of overtime, and do believe that it's necessary to look at this totality because of the not just the practice in budgeting, but also the scale of numbers that, in other words, the scale of the sums that are, where the shortfall is present. So, to come, and I think, Henry has a question.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
I wanted to ask the question because it appears based on the numbers that some agencies got hit proportionally higher than others. While the PEG memo requested a 5% across the board cut, and the agencies all got it. Parks, for instance, it seems to be has taken a 12% hit in talking to the commission and others. And I wonder if on those positions, particularly those for uniforms, there has been sort of an analysis of what those cuts will have manifested in terms of the overall 1.7 billion cut that was announced, and also in the outer years. So that's my first question. The second question regarding the asylum seekers and the difference between what appears to be the difference between the analysis that IBO performed and that or the OMB, other than, and I do have a term, it's called the come to Jesus budget money. I think you could use that. The come to Jesus budget moment is the term of art that I would suggest. But my point in all seriousness about this is that the difference between the estimates between OMB and IBO regarding the expenses of the potential expenses for the asylum seekers on the three scenarios that were presented seem to be very stark. And wonder if you can highlight into what those are.
Right.
Thank you.
So Henry, thank you for your questions. Maybe we should go through the presentations, because I think Claire's discussion of how we created or how she led the analysis will help answer most of those questions. Are there any other questions on Sarah's part?
I have a question that it might be too complex to do, because so many of the vacancies are in city agencies that actually help New Yorkers access benefits, cash assistance, rent subsidies, food stamps, all which have like a economic generative impact locally. Is there a way to assess how the delays in access impact the local economy? In addition to just, we know it's harmful to households that are dependent on entitlements, but I'm wondering if over time, if those positions aren't filled and access isn't expedited, we're gonna see the thing we don't wanna see, which is a drag on the economy, local economy.
So IBO recently testified on the mayor's management report, particularly highlighting places where performance metrics are well below where the city even sets its standard of where it would like to be. And many of the agencies in those areas that were performing sort of substandard were citing personnel. Lack of staffing was over and over one of the things they were highlighting. I'm not sure we can say specifically if I fill this position, so many people will then get food stamps, but I can look at performance of how many people are accessing different programs, cash assistance, SNAP, and look at how, as headcount has decreased, performance has staggered.
Yeah, so it doesn't quite answer your question, but we also have gotten information on the specific titles that are associated with each program. And so we are gonna be looking, we talked about that as, you know, sort of separate from our November plan analysis, but trying to look particularly at, you know, staffing levels, turnover rates, and specific titles that process benefits. And so that is something, and we, you know, Claire did note that some vacancy reductions taken in previous plans were reflected in the November plan. So that's giving us some it doesn't hit dollar wise in the November plan because it was taken previously, but we do plan to, once the dust settles a little bit on this, take a closer look at those particular areas and positions.
The last thing I would say, it might be good to look too at the city agency staffing processing payments for invoices, because with the contract provider delays of a year or more, and some are 9 months to a year or more, it also impacts workforce and access to things.
There is one of the overarching challenges we have is that the data system that we have access to shows us titles, but not the specific responsibility. And there's some of our agencies have titles in very broad sections of their workforce, so that we, so it's hard to be very data specific as to who exactly is doing what. But we are definitely attentive.
Revenue question?
Yes.
Before we move on. Could you discuss the property tax difference and how you see that both this year and going out? And it gets to be a significant difference with OMB, and obviously there's concern about commercial real estate, so if we could just walk through that.
On that front, I'm looking at our property tax, expert with that, so it might.
Sorry.
Not
really.
I might put Richard on the spot here. We saw. I don't want to misspeak, so Richard, if you want to jump in.
Okay, we don't really have like the details on how OMB is actually forecast, so it's hard to like compare exactly how we did it. And speculate. So. How can I speculate? Okay, so. I guess like what I would say is. We conduct our property tax forecast split by the tax classes, the 4 tax classes. And. The issues with commercial real estate. The way we tend to think about this, usually people think that's affecting one of the classes, class 4, commercial property. And so like, one way to think about the property tax forecast that we have is class 1 and class 3, so that's small residential and utility property. If you take the growth that we forecast in those 2 classes and you add that up, then you get a bit higher than OMB's forecast for growth. And that's assuming that class 2, that's large residential and commercial, doesn't increase at all in terms of its value. And so I'd say that I'm pretty comfortable saying that a reasonable forecast would be higher than that, because I don't think class 2 and class 4 are going to be flat in the next 3 years. I'm pretty confident class 1 and class 3 growth based on they're kind of class 1 pretty mechanical actually. We're pretty good at forecasting that. Class 3 is utility property, but
It's not that interesting.
it's not that
Other
interesting,
class.
but it grows like it's been growing at the same rate, and COVID did not affect that, so we're pretty confident in that. But then it really boils down to if you want to like reconcile it between us and OMB, is like what's our outlook on class 2 and class 4, and the rest like you can kind of like. So you can kind of think like the excess growth we have is split 50-50 between class 2 and class 4. So one thing we did in the forecast is we reduced our assessment of our forecast of the commercial offices to 2% growth. And that's, it used to be 6% growth, like pre-COVID. Now we put it in the forecast like a 2% growth. And that was like an out of model thing because we're trying to guess at what's going to happen to offices. But even if you shock that down to like 2% growth, like that's our forecast that we're given, you still get quite a substantial increase overall in these forecasts. So it's kind of forecasting is always a little bit of an art, but I think I'd be pretty confident in saying that we should forecast higher than OMB. I think that's a reasonable thing to do based on my understanding of the property tax system. And our 2% assumption, I think, is like a middle ground estimate right now out there. So there's people at NYU who put out the sort of controller's been calling a doomsday scenario, which is which would be a 6% per year drop. But in the controller in their report, they have like a 2% growth rate that they've thrown out. So like, it's hard to guess what's gonna happen to the assessed values of office property, right? But this is like, I think, a pretty middle ground number. So,
Thank you, Richard. And in general, with offices, we're seeing either they're renting up and sort of committing to being offices, but more people are concentrating into those buildings, or they're converting to residential, being sold with the intention of making them residential. So we have to, the conversion part has yet to sort of play out. And how,
Valuation there probably.
and
comes
how
down.
much that happens is still very unclear. So we took the sort of flatline commercial growth, but relative to where it used to be, but we're not projecting that's gonna completely tank.
Since it's such a full citywide debate, particularly on commercial, what's gonna happen, and maybe we're talking about other scenarios, both positive and negative, and a little more in-depth discussion.
It's a good suggestion.
I think I would say though, it's like Manhattan offices, so the one, that's the sector that people have been like shocking, to like say, and it's like 20% of the property tax revenues. If you shock it at the rate that people have been saying, like, it's not going to, you're not gonna get OMB's forecast by like taking a 6% decline, because it's not large enough per share. So if you're gonna build a scenario where you get OMB's kind of very slow growth to the property tax, it's like, but commercial real estate needs to not only reduce values of Manhattan offices, it needs to spill over into some, say, retail, the rest of class 4, maybe it also affects residential. Like, it needs to be more of a background to the real estate market, I think, than just isolated in the office sector. So the controller actually did like kind of a little simulation where they shock the office sector, and they find fairly modest. And if you just assume it's just the office sector, I mean, it's a big sector, but it's still, New York City is a very residential city. We have a lot of residential property value, so kind of.
Okay, thank you.
I think we have 3 questions that I can see. Mary?
Yeah, hello, thank you. Thank you for the report. I have 3 questions since I don't know about the details that went behind these numbers. So I'm curious how this have affected or whether they have been taken into consideration. 3 points. One is the out-migration from the city. We know that since the pandemic, there has been a huge number of people who moved out, and these are mostly middle income or higher income people who went to various other states, and not necessarily to lower tax states, but outside New York. How does that affect, how did it go into the calculations of the budget? And the second is, over the last year, I think the personal income taxes went down a lot because of the decline in capital gains. So was this also a factor in the calculations? And finally, another question that I'm really I've been concerned about is until the pandemic, the unemployment rate in the city and the state was always below the national level, and since then it's been above. So I was wondering whether you could say something to this effect, how whether this puts a downward risk to your forecast or not. Thank you.
Okay, I wrote down your questions, and let's see if we can answer them in order. Move outs from New York City. So this is a really interesting one because people did move out at the start of the pandemic, and there's a whole sort of reshuffling. It caused a lot of changes in the real estate market, particularly in the rental market. but also in the properties. People were buying and selling properties in late 2020, 2021, and that caused a real sort of spike in residential sales in 2021. So what's been interesting is people are moving out, but also people are moving into the city. And we've seen that even in our hires here at this office. As a
But there is a net out migrations in the net. New York City has lost.
Correct. And so one of the things our economic forecast is looking at sort of jobs created and GDP growth. We are projecting that the city will continue to add jobs, and that GDP growth will remain quite stable. In terms of revenues, we tend to look at where both the current year is and also past year's collections, but also how that translates and corresponds with our economic forecast. For personal income tax, we're looking at both, again, receipts thus far for quarterly payments on personal income tax. And we're looking at, of the jobs we're creating, are we expecting them to be higher sector jobs, lower sector jobs, and translating job creation into income tax. But if we're losing people, the question is, are there people moving in to fill them, and are there jobs for those who are looking for jobs? And then the unemployment rate, I don't think I have anything specific to say on it right now. Obviously, it's something we are tracking closely, and that ties in with the job creation and sort of matching people and skill sets to jobs.
And Mary, we'd be happy to talk with you offline or separately in much more detail, but I am keeping an eye on the clock.
Yeah, sure.
So, because they're complicated topics with a lot of different factors.
Yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
Should we do Wayne next? Yeah.
Yeah, a quick question more on positioning IBO, not necessarily on content, is that I did see the recent reports that IBO has done, from asylum seekers to the November plan, got picked up in City and State, the City, and other news sources. So I was wondering, A, have you all been doing more on trying to get your stuff out there? And B, are there other strategies you're considering? I know that's a larger conversation. I'm trying to be respectful of time, but I just wanted to, I know we've been talking about this for the last year plus.
So Wayne, the answer is yes. And we're very excited because OTI is in now the planning phase to rebuild our website, which we think is like step number one to be able to find our information. And China and Malek are new charged with increasing who we speak to, not just the press, but a far broader swath of both going to New Yorkers and having New Yorkers come to us. So, you know, a broader strategy, happy to discuss that also much more with you. But the short answer is absolutely. Plus, you know, I think we've also been very responsive to people's questions, so that people coming to us with questions, much of the reporting you're seeing are things that people came to us and asked us about. In a way that we're hoping will also amplify understanding of how IBO can put data-driven policy analysis into the larger conversation. Henry, is that okay, Wayne? Okay, Henry?
Yeah, just quickly, on the question regarding the people with the so-called entitlement programs, they were exempted from the PEGs, just FYI. We actually are hiring case managers, job opportunity specialists, and eligibility specialists. Not only were they exempt from the freeze, there's actually an approved PARs for those three titles. We negotiated that with OMB because of the 30,000 cases that we have for people still waiting to be processed. We're doing a lot of overtime and stuff like that, but it was impossible to process as many people as possible. So they did exempt them from the freeze and added actual positions to the roster this time around.
Right, thank you. And we may follow up with you because as I said, the data systems we have, we can't see the functionality, but you know, we're trying to understand more as we look at the MMR and balance that. Can we go Claire and then Peg? Is that okay? Claire, can you, any other questions or can we pivot to the asylum seekers? Take it away.
So there's sort of three main factors for the cost of asylum seekers. There's the population, there's the services offered, and then there's the prices the city pays for those services. So the main difference between OMB's calculation and ours has to do with the timing of when they did it and then the assumptions they made about those three things. So OMB did their projection earlier in the summer. So they took data through June and they took the rate that they were using for that time period. And they projected straight linear growth all through this year. And then in fiscal year 25, the population would remain flat. So they did this before exit notices had begun to expire. So they adjusted sort of slightly their linear growth, but they hadn't really fully even announced all of the exit policies when they did their projection. So we did ours later. So we incorporated a couple of different rates. So the daily household rate actually got more expensive in the summer. So we took the more expensive rate for our high estimate, and then our middle and our lower estimate are a lower daily household rate based on both OMB's stated goal of bringing down the rate, and then also they announced a 20% peg. And then the other big difference is how we thought about the population. So the city has announced exits policies for adults that have started to roll out. So we sort of broke the population into two parts, the families with children and then adults. And so in our middle and our high estimate, we have families growing exactly the same way that the city does. So straight linear growth. We looked at the summer, so we looked at a slightly later trend and then flat in the last year. And then with adults, because we were able to look after exits had already begun, like after the deadlines had begun to expire and people had started to leave, we looked at the observed difference in adult shelter to sort of base our estimate for the impact of exits. Once there's a couple more months of these exit policies, we'll have better data, but that's what we were able to do at this point. Anybody have any questions about that part?
Did you quantify that, the difference?
Yeah, so because we did some of these things together, we have to break them out. But the high cost scenario is keeping a higher rate and it's just incorporating adult exits. So that's the difference between OMB's 10.8 and our 7.8. So it's about $3 billion. Our middle cost scenario is when we also incorporated that rate change. So that accounts for the extra difference. And then our lower cost scenario is when we're thinking about if families also leave. We kept it the same for this year, but if they started to decline next year, fiscal year 25.
I think it's also important to note that we recognize that what we're calling exit requirements, i.e. the termination of services at 28, 30, or 60 days, depending on the individual circumstances, we don't believe that this will mean actual departure from the shelter system for all populations, but rather may result in the exited individual or family group returning, perhaps not immediately, so that the bureaucratic process of re-entering creates in effect a cycle that some use the phrase churn, which is perhaps not as respectful as one could be, but the point is that we don't believe that the exit requirements will in fact result in total exits.
They also complicate people's ability to get work authorization if they're filing for temporary protected status or they're filing for asylum and getting a work authorization. If their address is changing all the time, that also complicates their ability to leave shelter in the long term. And the most recent clinic that was opened a couple of weeks ago for TPS is only for people who are currently in shelter, but TPS to qualify, you had to have already been here earlier in the summer. So if you've exited, now you can't use this legal clinic. So there's a number of ways that exits complicate people's long-term ability to leave shelter.
We also, in our report, we flag a whole series of issues that we believe are really important for IBO to study if we can, and that we are waiting on appropriate data. Everything from the controller's change of the emergency blanket approval and the impact on how these services are procured. All the way through, if you look to economic benefits of asylum seekers as they enter the workforce, with you know, so that there are a whole series of factors that are in additional pieces of information that we believe would be very helpful for the public to understand, and we are waiting on appropriate data and look forward to receiving it.
The last thing I would say is just that there's the price issue, like how much are we paying for the daily household rate? The city, there's a huge range because of the way the city is doing procurement, where they're doing emergency contracts with big for-profits for some things. There's a really wide range of what the city is paying for this, some of the same things like laundry or food, or like the same type of work across vendors. So it even came up in a hearing that if they can transition to more nonprofits and to more traditional procurement strategies, which they might have to restructure some of their RFPs to make that happen, that's a way that they can reduce costs without exits and without cutting services.
And the difference, I thought, the difference is on top of the peg that they announced for the asylum seekers. I was a little confused about
So what was confusing is that they did the November plan and then they announced it, so theirs doesn't account for it at all.
Okay.
And so that's sort of why we have that rate change is
That helps a
incorporating
lot.
the 20%. Yeah.
You should make that point, actually, because it gets a little bit lost in this. And how much is that difference? What are they attributing, or what are you attributing to that peg?
So it could come from a couple of different things. So one of the things that it could come from is that switch from emergency contracting to more traditional competitive procurement. It could also come from exits. So we didn't, we could probably speak more of the different things it could come to, but we didn't make a choice about where we thought it would come from. We just sort of incorporated it into
I mean,
the,
the 20%.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know, but it needs to be in effect by January, so, you know, we have some ideas.
Yeah, we did have a note that states if you take that 20% reduction to the per diem rate, it would be roughly 315, which is a little bit lower than our, low cost 320 estimate that we use.
Henry, does this report answer your questions on asylum seekers?
Partially. I was looking specifically at one of the biggest pieces that appears to be controversial, which is the housing cost associated with the estimates. There's a meeting tomorrow at the White House, which I'm attending, to discuss this. And one of the questions has to do with the city's estimate for housing the asylum seekers on a per night basis. It's about 2.5 times what the federal government allows. And I just needed that specifically because I think it's going to be part of the discussion tomorrow at that meeting.
One thing I can say is that the way that the city is calculating the daily household costs for asylum seekers is different than what they normally do for households in shelter and DHS. So households in DHS, that per diem is shelter and food and services. What the city has done for asylum seekers is they've taken all of the costs, which include like setting up an IT system to have more centralized data, setting up the intake center, setting up Randall's Island. All of those costs get incorporated into like one sort of giant amount of money, and then they're just dividing by the population. So that's why you get that much higher per diem. There's also a pretty significant range in the cost of hotels for different households across vendors and across agencies. And some of that has to do with this like emergency procurement issue that we're talking about. I don't know if that makes it any more helpful.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I think this is one of the most complicated discussions because the feds believe that is an appropriate use way of seeking reimbursement under the current DHS policy. Department of Homeland Security has a publication that is very specific, and I think it's one of those disputes where the mayor goes and speaks with the delegation and asks for reimbursement for the asylum seekers to the tune of 4.3 billion. And the feds say, well, you're exaggerating. And the state seems to be leaning towards the feds assessment of this. It's very problematic if we don't at least have a clear understanding of what you just said, of these additional things that are being counted in on the housing per diem rate. But thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and Henry, if you have specific follow-up questions, please do reach out because we're happy to talk at great length. Claire has spent months studying the variables and we appreciate it for the controller's office and the terms and conditions from the city council, adding great transparency. We recognize that OMB has given us a great deal of information. You know, we really do struggle, having done the best quality math, to explain how, for example, they go to 6 billion next year and we at the highest cost level see 4.7 billion. You know, understanding all the variables. So there's some level of basic disagreement as to that. Okay, it's 9:15. Should we move to a quick discussion on PEGs?
Sure. So very quickly, we are hopefully going to release this report soon, but you know, predicated on the additional expenses of the asylum seekers, the OMB did announce in September, very uniquely, an upcoming 3 rounds of PEGs, the first of which was implemented in the November plan. So 5% reduction in city funds for non-mayoral agency budgets. And then plan for subsequent 5% additional reductions to city funds coming up in preliminary in January and then executive in April. And so in total over the 4 years, there's a $7.6 billion reduction to city funds, 1.7 billion for 2024, and then 1.9 billion for each of the 3 following years of the planned city fiscal years. So we did a really unique exercise this time, which was, and it kind of gets to Henry's point, not exactly what Henry was describing in terms of specific agencies, but rather looking within a particular agency at not just the largest dollar amounts, but also the PEGs that would impact sort of the everyday living of New Yorkers. And so looking at areas that could span, like the environment, across multiple agencies, including parks, DEP, and sanitation, in terms of litter pickup. But then also, you know, we can't necessarily quantify how many people this would impact, but that it would generally impact, we call them, you know, human impact PEGs. And so just to give you, you know, sort of high level, we categorize them into broad categories. So the largest of that being public safety, which includes the reduction, you know, the class cancellation for NYPD, as well as the reduction in school safety agents at schools. So that's about 40% of the PEGs that we identified. So I should say that our PEGs in total account for 2.3 billion out of the 7.6 billion that was the total PEGs in the plan. The next category is student and youth services, which is also pretty substantial. So this covers reductions in both Department of Education as well as youth and community development, impacting early childhood, which we've talked about, as well as after school, summer youth employment and summer rising slots, And so that's the next largest category. We also looked at impact for reductions that affect individuals who are justice involved. And so this includes both within the Department of Corrections, but also alternatives to incarceration and reductions in those types of programs. The next largest category is arts, cultural affairs, and libraries. And we point out that these are areas that often are common, sort of low-hanging fruit, so to speak, in times of budget reductions, and tend to be reductions that that come up in negotiations with City Council as we near the adopted budget. So that's another large area. And I would say there's a couple of other areas, but the next largest one are job training and workforce development programs, which are also being impacted. And we think that's critical to point out because obviously those also have an impact on more directly on the economy. And so that, affects other areas that we look at, revenue projections and things like that. So more details to come in the report, hopefully tomorrow.
But a different way of, an attempt to comprehensively look at the pegs and not judge their operational feasibility, but rather try and quantify how these reductions to our city budget might impact individuals existing in New York, where they
Can I
may
ask a
feel
question?
Yes.
How much of the PEG is underspending or projected underspend versus actual cuts?
Yeah, so that's the difference between the 2.7 and the 6.7, right? There's a large section that is underspending or other inside agency administrative efficiencies, some vacancy reductions, other things that we didn't quantify as impacting New Yorkers per se, but rather were sort of shifts within agency operations in terms of streamlining, etc.
Yeah, and we do talk about within these broader categories, which ones are re-estimates, and point out that at this point, we don't have enough information to say whether that directly translates to services that weren't provided per se, or if they are related to efficiencies.
But you do know that, right? Because it's a standard practice for OMB to write plan by plan, put up what we know is traditionally underspending. And I guess I say that because the minute you said ATDs, I'm like, we never spent all of that. It was just so much money that we put in that it was just impossible for nonprofits to get the capacity up to actually spend it. But I think, so I guess that's why I'm asking, like, if you went back and looked at prior plans, could you see where that is to kind of just get a sense of this is typical things they put up year over year, plan over plan?
Yeah, we didn't exactly look back at prior plans, but we did note areas that OMB pointed out were re-estimates, where it was within particular content areas or topics. We do have one section that's specifically about, re-estimates for some programs that didn't fit more clearly into larger areas, but we didn't do that exercise sort of citywide as a number in this report. So that's something that we can definitely look at.
Okay.
Quick question, the reduction in classes, is that a cash reduction? Is it a temporary reduction or is it a permanent reduction? Do we know?
It's a cancellation, so it is.
But it's a cancellation that will be made up in the next fiscal year, or is it if they have said it's a permanent cancellation?
Right.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's the other, sure.
Okay, we have 7 minutes. Are there any further questions on the November plan? We wanted to highlight 2 other recent publications. And I want to be respectful of people's time. So Brian, you want to speak really fast?
So Jordan, are you good to go really fast?
Jordan?
Good morning, everybody. For the past 7 months, Brian and I have been working on a report about stormwater fees. So I was fully 7 months to research in 3 minutes. So back in February of this 2023, we had did a budget option about what New York City, the revenue New York City could generate if they were to implement stormwater fees. That was a 1-pager, and May, Assemblymember Emily Gallagher of the 50th district in New York State, which is Williamsburg, Greenpoint area. She had reached out to us and wanted us to expand on our research so she could. She's currently working on a bill in the Assembly, Bill A4019, which authorizes local and water sewer authorities to charge fees for surface runoff. So currently in New York State, there's only one jurisdiction, which is Ithaca, New York, that charges stormwater fees, and there are many other jurisdictions that have this interest, but there is a lot of ambiguity around it right now. And this bill is intended to help clear some of that ambiguity. So as I mentioned, only one municipality in New York State with a stormwater fee, although there are thousands of jurisdictions across the country of all different sizes, from municipalities that have 5,000 people to places as large as Seattle, San Francisco, very large cities have these fees. And this is something that New York, DEP, the Water Board, various entities in the city are looking to do. So our research really looked at 3 main things. First, how much revenue would New York City generate if it modeled the stormwater rate after other large cities? So Brian and I looked into 4 peer cities, the city of Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Seattle. And we estimated, based on a model, that New York City could generate between $266 million and $892 million, depending on how they structure the fee. So it goes to say that really, depending how the fee is structured, the revenue generated could be very wide. And with the revenues that come in, New York City and the Department of Environmental Protection currently has about $6.5 billion worth of infrastructure projects that they're working on in regards to stormwater fees. So this could be things such as expanding underground infrastructure to have more rainwater pass through them. So that can be through combined sewer retention tanks. There is a project right now in the Gowanus Canal that's $1.5 billion that DEP is currently doing. There's also projects in Flushing Bay out in Harlem that are being undertaken by DEP right now. So currently, the way that DEP funds these projects are through metered rates. So we all pay a water bill whether we know it or not. Some people pay their water bill directly, and some people pay it through just the rent. And so the second question we looked at was whether the rate structure will impact the total water bill of some properties more than others. And how we determined that was we studied the distributional effect of stormwater fees on ratepayers throughout the neighborhoods. And we found that people outside of Manhattan will pay larger stormwater fees because of things such as having more land and impervious surface in these areas. Just the median income in these areas aren't as high, and just for a few other reasons. And the last thing we looked at was the bond rating and how the bond rating of the Municipal Water Finance Authority would be affected. And so to determine that, we looked at 5 different water authorities that have implemented a stormwater fee within the last 10 years. And we saw their rating when they adopted the stormwater fee, their rating 2 years post-adoption, and what their current rating is now. And our research found that only one jurisdiction had any sort of negative effect with their bond rating, but we can't attribute that to stormwater fee. There are a lot of things that go into the bond rating and how the credit rating agencies rate these scores. And so other than that one jurisdiction, they did see an increase in their bond rating in the most recent 2023 rating scale. So like I said, we can't attribute that to stormwater fees, and that was a big concern of OMB and the, of OMB in implementing stormwater fees. So just a very quick synopsis of our report. Like I said, Brian and I, been working on this in March or May rather. And we thank you for letting us talk to you about it here today.
I think it's important to note that if the city were to choose to pursue stormwater fees, it's a closed loop revenue system. So that the additional monies that can come in would not go into the general fund, but rather would need to be within the water board authority.
We have to spend it on water.
Exactly, you could spend it on better water, but it wouldn't offset other fiscal challenges directly.
There's one small exception to that. The city can charge the water authority a lease payment, and that would be just under $300 million for next year. But they could do that even if we don't have a stormwater fee. So
Nice report.
thanks.
It's a fun one to work on.
Okay, Julie, or should we? It's up there. Can we ask people to stay 10 more minutes and listen to immigrant children, 3 minutes,
Yes.
5 minutes, immigrant children? It was great testimony.
Thank you.
Okay, Julia Conrad, education.
Hi. So on November 29th, we testified in front of the City Council Joint Committees on Immigration and Education. And the topic of the hearing was on supports for immigrant students in New York City public schools. So this is a topic we've been following for a while, but because we had just gotten new data from the Department of Education and our data manager, Thomas, on the education team turned around that new data in days, literally, we were able to offer new information, which was really exciting as a team. So what we shared with the council was that nearly 19% of all students in New York City public schools are English language learners. So in other words, that's 1 in 5 K through 12 students, and that's an increasing share over the last couple of years. And another notable difference about those students is that as of the last school year, nearly a third of New York City's ELs were at the beginning level of English proficiency. And that's actually a piece of information that we were able to offer that the DOE doesn't share. That's an increasing share of students. So in comparison, in 2019-20, 19% of ELs were at that entering level. So from 19% to a third of students, not only do we have higher shares of ELs, but they are at the entering level of proficiency. So they're going to require different supports. The other piece of information we shared was the breakdown of students by bilingual versus English as a new language programs. Those are different. Bilingual programs are offered in students' home language. There's 2 different kinds. English as a new language is normally offered in English. So we were able to share that as of last school year, roughly 79% of ELs are in those English as a new language programs. So that means about 20% are now in bilingual. That's actually an increasing share from the year before. And that's notable given that there are more ELs who have higher levels of entering proficiency or lower levels of proficiency at that entering level. So that's something to note too, because the DOE has been really focused on expanding bilingual programs. 80% is still a lot of students to be in English as a new language as opposed to bilingual, but it is something that we see progress in. And then the final piece of information we shared based on our report earlier this year was a count of how many bilingual teachers there are and English as a new language. That's a really big policy conversation right now in the city. And just to note, in the last couple of months, there has been movement both at the city level and state level to increase the supply of bilingual teachers. So that's a notable limitation to expanding programs, is a shortage of bilingual teachers. To be a bilingual teacher, you need both a certification in a content area and an extension in a specific language, a bilingual language, whatever that language is. So it's a barrier for teachers. That's a conversation that's happening at council and also at the DOE. There have been some changes about teacher tenure rules. There have been some changes about how you get that bilingual extension at the state level. As of now, they're temporary. So that's something that we're also looking at and tracking on the education team. Do we see the supply of bilingual teachers increase? And can it match the need of students?
Julia, do you have data as to what the top
Yes.
usage languages are?
So we have, I will say, so we look at there's 3 different languages. We look at students' home language, we look at bilingual teachers and languages that they offer, and then the city's programs. The top language for students is Spanish. So I think it's, oh, it's on my next page. We have 66% of L's speak Spanish at home. The next most common category is Chinese languages, which we group together because the DOE does in certain contexts. That's 10% of L's. And then the third most common language is Arabic, 5% of L's. One thing that council asked us about when we shared was that that doesn't match the breakdown of programs. So you don't have that same structure. We have the highest share of programs, bilingual programs, are in Spanish, and they're actually higher than that share of students, then Chinese languages, and then actually French. So if you were to look at like a match and a mismatch, I would say it's the Arabic speaking students and the Arabic bilingual programs. We don't see a similar share across the two. For teachers, the majority of bilingual teachers are also in Spanish. 88% of bilingual teachers have their license in Spanish. So in terms of proportions, we do see that line up a little bit better, but yeah.
Any questions on English language learners in the public school system? Great. So I want to laud the entire IBO staff for their incredible work ethic, volume of production, and also transformation, because remember, we're doing a whole lot of things behind the scenes in terms of shifting how we do processes. I also want to thank the advisory board for advising us on many of these, or every single report that has been published since September has had an advisory board, at least one advisory board reader. And we thank you because you're really giving us your expertise and helping us think about how to better explain, how to add additional data points, how to clarify where there are things we can't answer. So thank you. And that's all I have. Any other questions for the IBO?
Thank you. I think we're going to adjourn. Everybody have a happy, safe holiday.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Thank you.